Pick it up, he said, like she wasn't even a person. The words didn't echo, they sliced, clean and sharp, through the soft jazz and clinking glasses of the $500 plate dining room. For a moment, everything paused. Forks hovered midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the chandelier light felt colder, like it was watching. Naomi Brooks stood still, a folded linen napkin resting against her palm, her posture straight, her expression calm. She had learned long ago that silence could be armor. At 26, she had worked double shifts, carried trays heavier than her own doubts, and endured looks that spoke louder than words ever could. And this wasn't new. Across the table, Ethan Carter leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his face like he had just told the cleverest joke in the world. His watch alone could pay Naomi's rent for 6 months, and he wore it like proof of something he never earned. Around him, his friends laughed, not because it was funny, but because power has a way of teaching people when to laugh. Someone nearby subtly tilted their phone, recording. Not openly. Never openly. Just enough to capture the moment without becoming part of it. That's what you're paid for, Ethan added, louder this time, making sure the room heard him, making sure she did too. Naomi's fingers tightened just slightly around the napkin. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to remind herself she was still in control. Because dignity doesn't always come from what you say. Sometimes, it comes from what you refuse to become. The restaurant itself was the kind of place where deals worth tens of millions of dollars were whispered over wine lists thicker than most books. Glass walls stretched 30 floors above the city, overlooking a skyline built on ambition and illusion. People didn't just come here to eat. They came to be seen, to belong, or at least, to pretend they already did. And Ethan Carter? He belonged more than anyone, or at least, that's what he believed. The son of William Carter, a billionaire whose name sat on buildings, contracts, and headlines, Ethan had grown up in rooms where no one ever told him no. Respect was something he expected, not something he understood. So when Naomi didn't move immediately, when she didn't bend, didn't rush, didn't shrink the way he expected, something in his expression shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. Did you not hear me? He asked, tilting his head, his voice dipping into something colder now. Around them, the air tightened. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just heavy. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention but demands it anyway. Naomi met his gaze for the first time. Not with defiance. Not with fear. Just steady. Present. Human. And that was the moment everything began to change. Because what Ethan didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that power doesn't always sit where you think it does. Sometimes, it's standing right behind you, waiting for the exact moment to speak. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and sharp, like glass about to crack. Ethan scoffed under his breath, rolling his shoulders as if the moment bored him, but his fingers tapped once against the edge of the table, a small betrayal of something unsettled beneath the surface. Around him, the laughter faded, replaced by that quiet tension money could not buy its way out of. Naomi did not bend. She did not rush. She simply lowered the napkin onto the table instead of the floor, smooth, precise, intentional. A small act. But in a room like this, small acts carried weight. One of Ethan's friends shifted in his seat, glancing between them, then quickly looking away. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge that something had gone wrong. Because once you see it, you cannot pretend it is not there. Unbelievable, Ethan muttered, louder now, forcing a chuckle that did not quite land. You really think you can just ignore me? His voice rose just enough to reclaim attention, to pull the room back under his control, or at least the illusion of it. Naomi held his gaze for half a second longer, then gently turned, reaching for a nearby glass, refilling it with steady hands. Professional, composed, untouchable in a way he did not understand. That was what irritated him most. Not defiance, not disrespect, but the absence of reaction, because power, the kind Ethan had grown up with, depended on response. On people bending, flinching, apologizing. Without that, it felt hollow. Do you even know who I am? He pressed, leaning forward now, his tone sharpening. It was a question he had never asked without already knowing the answer would satisfy him. Naomi paused, just for a breath. Then, without looking at him, she said softly, I know enough. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it landed. The kind of sentence that does not need volume to carry meaning. A few tables away, someone inhaled quietly. Another phone lifted slightly higher. The moment was no longer contained. It was spreading, and Ethan felt it. That subtle shift in the room where attention stops being yours and starts watching you instead. His jaw tightened. "No, I do not think you do," he said, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Because if you did, you would not be standing there like that." Naomi finished pouring the glass and placed the bottle down with care. No sudden movements. No visible tension. Just control. The kind that cannot be taught in boardrooms or inherited through last names. And that was when it happened. Not a shout. Not a dramatic entrance. Just a voice, calm and measured, from behind him. Like what exactly? It was quiet enough that it did not compete with the room. It replaced it. Conversation stopped without being asked to. Heads turned without realizing they had. Even the air seemed to shift direction. Ethan froze for a fraction of a second before turning, already preparing the confident smile he had worn his entire life. But it faltered the moment he saw who was standing there. Because some names carry weight, and some people do not need to raise their voice to be heard. William Carter did not look angry. Not yet. He looked something far more dangerous. Disappointed. His gaze moved past Ethan, resting briefly on Naomi, taking in everything without asking a single question. Then back to his son. And in that quiet exchange, something invisible but undeniable settled over the room. The kind of presence that does not ask for control. It already has it. William Carter did not repeat himself. He did not need to. The question lingered in the air, heavier than any raised voice could ever be. Ethan straightened slightly, forcing a casual laugh that came a second too late, the kind of laugh that tries to erase a moment that has already been seen. "Dad, it is nothing," he said quickly, waving a hand as if the entire room had imagined it. Just a misunderstanding. But the room had not imagined it. The phone still hovered, subtle but steady, capturing every second. And William knew it. His eyes did not leave Ethan's face. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, not as a question, but as something he was measuring, weighing, testing for truth. Behind that calm tone was something far more precise than anger. It was judgment. The kind that does not shout. The kind that decides. Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides now, no longer moving, no longer serving, just present. Not as staff, not as background, but as someone who could not be ignored anymore. William's gaze shifted to her again, softer this time, not with pity, but with recognition. He had built his empire on reading people, on understanding what others overlooked. And in that brief glance, he saw everything he needed to see. The restraint, the dignity, the choice not to escalate when she easily could have. That mattered. It always had. "What exactly did you say to her?" William asked, turning back to Ethan, his voice still even, still controlled. Around them, chairs creaked slightly as people adjusted, leaning in without realizing it. This was no longer a private moment. It had become something else entirely. Ethan hesitated, just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Because hesitation, in rooms like this, speaks louder than denial. "I told her to do her job," he replied, lifting his chin, trying to recover ground he could already feel slipping. "That is all." William did not react immediately. He let the silence stretch again, let the weight of the words settle into the space between them. Then he asked, "Is that what you think her job is?" It was a simple question, but it was not simple at all. Ethan frowned slightly, confusion mixing with irritation. "She is staff," he said. "She serves. That is what she is here for." A few people shifted uncomfortably at that. Not because they disagreed, but because of how it sounded when said out loud. William exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in something closer to realization. Not about Naomi. About his son. "No," he said quietly. "That is what you think she is here for." The distinction was small, but it changed everything. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come as easily this time. Because for the first time that night, the room was not on his side. It was watching him, waiting. And William could feel it too. The shift, the expectation, the truth that moments like this do not stay contained. They travel. They define. "You said my name in this room tonight," William continued, his tone steady, his presence filling the space without effort. "You used it to justify how you treated her." He paused, just long enough for Ethan to understand where this was going. That makes this my responsibility. The sentence landed quietly, but it carried consequences neither of them could ignore. And for the first time since he sat down, Ethan Carter did not look like the most powerful person at the table. He looked like someone who had just realized power was never his to begin with. The room did not breathe. It waited. Not for noise, not for drama, but for a decision. And William Carter had never been a man who delayed decisions. Ethan shifted in his seat, the confidence he wore like a tailored suit now sitting just a little too tight. "Dad, you are overreacting," he said, forcing a smile that no longer convinced anyone, not even himself. "It was just a comment. That is all. You are making it into something bigger than it is." But William did not respond immediately. He stepped closer to the table instead, slow, deliberate, every movement measured like a man who understood that power is not in speed, but in control. His eyes moved across the faces at the table, then briefly toward the phone still recording, then back to his son. He saw everything. And more importantly, he understood what it meant. "No," William said quietly. "You already made it something bigger." The words were calm, but they carried weight that pressed against every corner of the room. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It is a private dinner," he pushed back, his voice sharper now, reaching for ground that was no longer there. "No one cares." A faint sound came from across the room. Not laughter, not conversation, just the subtle shift of someone adjusting their phone, the glow of a screen reflecting in a wine glass. Someone cared. More than someone. And William noticed. He always noticed. "You still do not see it," William said, almost to himself, but loud enough that Ethan could not escape it. "That is the problem." He rested a hand lightly on the back of the chair. Not sitting, not settling, just anchoring himself in the moment. "This company," he continued, "was not built on money alone. Money is easy. It comes and it goes. What holds it together is trust, reputation, the belief that when people walk into a room with our name on it, they will be treated with respect." He let that settle before adding, "You just broke that." Ethan's expression flickered. Not fully shaken. Not yet. But something cracked beneath the surface. "You are talking like I destroyed the company over a sentence," he said, a hint of disbelief creeping in. William looked at him then, really looked at him, the way a man looks at something he thought he understood but no longer did. "No," he replied. "I am talking like a man who has spent 30 years building something that can be damaged in 30 seconds. The contrast hung there, undeniable. 30 years. 30 seconds. Around them, the silence deepened, not out of discomfort now, but out of recognition. This was no longer about a waitress. It was about something much larger. Naomi remained where she was, still composed, still quiet, but no longer invisible. She had become the center without asking for it, the reason this moment existed at all. And yet she did nothing to claim it. That, more than anything, made the difference. William's gaze softened again when it passed over her, a silent acknowledgement, then returned to Ethan, sharper now, resolved. "You used my name tonight," he said. "You used it to elevate yourself while diminishing someone else." A pause. Just long enough. That is not leadership. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came this time. Because deep down, even he could feel it now. The shift. The truth. The fact that this was no longer something he could laugh off or talk his way around. William straightened slightly, his decision no longer forming, but formed. "And I will not allow it to represent me." The words did not explode. They settled. Heavy. Final. The kind of words that do not need volume because they carry consequence. Ethan stared at his father, waiting for something to soften, for a signal that this was still a performance he could recover from. But William Carter did not blink. He did not look away. "You will leave this table," William said, his voice even, controlled, but absolute. No raised tone. No anger. Just a line drawn so clearly that no one in the room could pretend it was not there. A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but undeniable. Chairs shifted. Eyes widened. Phone steadied. This was no longer tension. This was resolution. Ethan let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head as if the moment had gone too far to be real. "You cannot be serious," he said, leaning forward, searching his father's face for anything familiar, anything that still belonged to him. "Over this. In front of everyone." His voice dropped slightly on the last words, not out of humility, but out of fear, not of consequence, of exposure. William did not answer immediately. He let the question hang, not because he needed time, but because Ethan needed to hear the silence around it. The room had chosen its side, and it was not his. Especially in front of everyone, William replied. The distinction landed like a quiet verdict. Because this was not about punishment. It was about accountability. And accountability does not happen in private when the damage was done in public. Ethan's composure fractured, just slightly. This is insane, he muttered, running a hand through his hair, glancing around as if someone would step in, someone would laugh it off, someone would remind his father who he was. But no one moved. No one spoke. Because for the first time, Ethan Carter was not the center of power in the room. He was the example. William took a slow breath, his gaze steady, unwavering. You are not ready to represent this company, he said. Not in meetings. Not in decisions. Not in rooms like this. Each phrase was deliberate, measured, not emotional, definitive. Ethan's face tightened. I am your son, he said, the words coming out sharper now, not as a statement, but as a shield. William nodded once, acknowledging it without hesitation. And that is exactly why this matters, he answered. No anger, no hesitation, just truth. A truth that did not bend for blood, for legacy, or for comfort. Around them, the silence shifted again. It was no longer tense. It was clear. The kind of clarity that comes when something hidden is finally said out loud. Naomi stood where she had always stood, but everything around her had changed. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded justice. She had simply remained who she was. And somehow, that had been enough to reveal everything else. William turned slightly toward her, not fully, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge her presence again, his voice softening for the first time that night. Miss Brooks, he said, using her name with care, with intention, I apologize for what you experienced here. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as a gesture, as a correction, as a man taking responsibility for what his name had allowed. Naomi met his gaze, calm as ever, and gave a small nod. No performance, no speech, just acknowledgement. And somehow, that silence said more than anything else in the room. Behind them, Ethan stood frozen, caught between disbelief and realization, between who he thought he was and what the room had just shown him he was not. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, the power he had always leaned on was no longer standing behind him. It had stepped away. The distance between them felt wider than the entire room. Ethan did not move at first, as if standing still could somehow reverse what had already been said. His eyes searched his father's face one more time, looking for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that resembled the man who used to excuse him, protect him, elevate him. But William Carter stood unchanged, grounded, unmoved by the weight of expectation that had once defined their relationship. You are really doing this, Ethan said quietly, the arrogance in his voice thinning into something unfamiliar, something closer to disbelief. It was not loud anymore. It was not for the room. It was for himself. William did not answer with more words. He had already said enough. Instead, he stepped back slightly, creating space, not just physically, but symbolically. The kind of space that tells you exactly where you stand without needing to explain it. Around them, the energy shifted again, but this time it was different. It was not tension. It was clarity. The kind that settles after a storm, when everything is still but nothing is the same. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer controlled. For the first time, he looked around not as the center of attention, but as someone being seen, truly seen. And what he saw reflected back was not admiration, not envy, not even fear. It was something far quieter. Disapproval, not loud enough to humiliate him, but strong enough to change how the room would remember him. A chair scraped softly as he stepped back, the sound louder than it should have been, cutting through the silence like a final note. No one stopped him. No one spoke his name. Because this moment was not about rescue. It was about consequence. Naomi remained where she was, her presence steady, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. But inside, something had shifted. Not pride, not victory, something deeper. Recognition, not of what she had done, but of what she had refused to do. She had not lowered herself. She had not responded in anger. She had not become the version of herself that moments like this try to force out of people. And that restraint had done more than any reaction ever could. William watched Ethan take another step back, then another, until the distance between them was no longer just measured in feet, but in understanding. "You will speak with legal tomorrow," William said finally, his voice calm, procedural, as if discussing any other business matter. "Your access to company accounts, meetings, and representation privileges will be suspended effective immediately." The words were precise, not emotional, structured. This was not a father reacting. This was a leader acting. Ethan paused at the edge of the table, his hand resting briefly on the back of a chair, gripping it just slightly before letting go. He did not argue this time, because deep down, he knew arguing would only confirm what had already been decided. And so, without another word, he turned and walked away. No dramatic exit. No slammed doors. Just footsteps fading into the distance, quieter with each step, until they disappeared completely into the hum of a city that would not pause for him. The room remained still for a moment longer, as if everyone needed time to recalibrate, to process what they had just witnessed. Because moments like this do not happen often. Not in places like this. Not with people like that. William stood in that silence, not victorious, not proud, just certain. Then he turned back toward Naomi, not as a CEO, not as a man of power, but as someone who understood that respect is not proven by what you build, but by how you treat the people who stand quietly in your presence. And in that quiet, something far more powerful than money had just been restored. The room did not return to normal. Not immediately. Conversations did not resume the way they had before, light and careless, as if nothing had happened. Instead, there was a pause that lingered, a quiet recalibration as people adjusted not just their posture, but their understanding of what they had just witnessed. Power had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. William Carter stood still for a moment longer, letting the silence settle into something stable, something grounded. He did not rush to fill it. He did not perform. Because real authority does not need to recover from a moment. It defines it. Slowly, the faint clink of glass returned. A chair moved. Someone cleared their throat. The world began again, but softer now, more aware. Naomi reached for the bottle again, her movements smooth, practiced, as if nothing inside her had changed. But everything had. Not in a way that demanded attention, in a way that deepened her stillness. She poured a glass for a nearby guest, her hands steady, her expression calm, the same quiet professionalism she had carried all night. But now, people looked at her differently. Not because she asked them to, because they could not unsee what they had just learned. A man who had barely acknowledged her before now met her eyes and said, "Thank you." Clearly, fully, without hesitation. It was a small thing. But small things, in rooms like this, reveal everything. William noticed it too. He noticed how the energy around her had shifted, how respect had moved into the space where dismissal once lived. And he understood that this moment was not just about correction. It was about restoration. He stepped slightly closer, not invading her space, not interrupting her work, just present enough to speak without raising his voice. "You handled that with more restraint than most people in this room would have," he said quietly. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. Naomi glanced at him briefly, then back to her work, placing the glass down with care. "I have had practice," she replied, her tone even, not bitter, not defensive, just honest. William nodded once. He understood more than she said. Because people like him had spent years learning how to read what was not spoken. "That should not have been necessary," he said. And for the first time, there was something in his voice that was not just authority. It was responsibility. Naomi did not respond immediately. She adjusted a plate slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small act of order in a room that had just experienced disorder. "It usually is," she said softly. Not as a complaint. As a fact. The truth of it settled between them. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just real. Around them, the dinner continued, but the tone had changed. Conversations were quieter, more measured. Laughter was softer, more deliberate. Because once a room witnesses accountability, it becomes harder to ignore its absence. William straightened slightly, his gaze moving across the room once more, not as a man checking control, but as someone ensuring it had been restored in the right way. Then he looked back at Naomi. "If you ever choose not to stay in a room where you are treated that way," he said, "you will still belong in better ones." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than an offer. They carried recognition. Naomi paused, just for a second, then met his gaze fully this time. "I already know that," she said. And in that moment, there was no imbalance. No hierarchy. Just two people who understood that value is not assigned by status, but revealed by character. And somewhere beyond the glass walls, the city lights continued to flicker, unaware that inside that room, something far more lasting than a business deal had just been decided. The dinner continued, but it was no longer just a dinner. It had become a story in motion, one that people were already beginning to carry beyond the walls of the room. A phone buzzed softly near the edge of the table, then another. Screens lit up, not with messages about stock prices or meeting notes, but with clips, short, silent videos capturing the moment when everything shifted. A glance, a sentence, a decision. It was already out there. William Carter noticed it without looking directly. He had lived long enough in this world to understand how quickly moments like this travel, how they reshape narratives before anyone has time to control them. But for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for control. Because this time, the truth did not need managing. It needed to be seen. Naomi moved between tables, her steps steady, her presence unchanged, but the space around her felt different now. Conversations paused when she approached, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness. People chose their words more carefully. They straightened slightly. They acknowledged her. Not because they were told to, because they had witnessed what happens when respect is not optional. At one table, a woman in a tailored navy dress looked up as Naomi refilled her glass. "You handled that with grace," she said quietly, not seeking attention, not performing kindness, just stating something real. Naomi offered a small nod, nothing more. She did not collect praise. She carried herself. Across the room, two men leaned closer over a phone, replaying the moment, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something deeper. Not shock, recognition, the kind that stays with you longer than the video itself. Because what they saw was not just a confrontation. It was a standard being set. William stood near the edge of the table, observing not as a spectator, but as someone who understood the ripple effect of a single decision. This was not about salvaging an image. It was about defining one. And tonight, that definition had been made clear in a way no statement or press release could ever achieve. He turned slightly as his assistant approached, discreet, composed, handing him a tablet with a brief glance. William scanned the screen for a second, then another. The clip was already trending. Views climbing. Comments multiplying. Not all of them kind. Not all of them fair. But most of them aligned on one thing. Accountability. He handed the tablet back without a word. Because numbers did not matter as much as what those numbers represented. A shift in expectation. A demand for something better. Naomi paused briefly near the service station, her hands resting lightly on the counter, just for a second, just enough to breathe. Not from exhaustion. From awareness. She knew the moment had not ended when Ethan walked away. It had only begun to unfold. But she did not chase it. She did not replay it. She returned to what she controlled. Her work. Her presence. Her choices. And that was where her strength had always lived. William watched her for a moment longer, then spoke quietly to his assistant, his voice low, measured. "Make sure her manager knows she has my full support," he said, "and that this situation will be addressed properly. Not as a favor. Not as compensation. As a standard." His assistant nodded and stepped away. The room continued to move, to adjust, to settle into a new normal that felt slightly different, slightly more intentional. Because once people witness a moment where power aligns with principle, it becomes harder to accept anything less. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of glasses being filled and plates being cleared, a new understanding took hold. Not announced, not declared, just present. The kind that does not fade when the night ends. The kind that follows people home, into conversations, into decisions, into the way they choose to see others the next time they sit at a table like this. By the time the last plates were cleared, the room no longer felt like a place built on power alone. It felt recalibrated. Not quieter, not smaller, but sharper. As if everyone present had been reminded of something they once knew but had slowly forgotten. Naomi folded a final linen napkin with the same care she had shown all night, her movements precise, unhurried, untouched by the weight of everything that had unfolded around her. She did not linger on the moment. She did not replay it in her mind. Because for her, this was never about proving anything. It was about remaining something. And she had. Across the room, guests began to stand, chairs sliding back in soft, controlled motions, conversations returning in low, thoughtful tones. But the energy was different now. People looked at one another longer. They chose their words with more intention. They acknowledged the staff in ways they had not before. Not dramatically, not performatively, just correctly. William Carter stood near the window, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, a reflection of everything he had built. But tonight, he was not looking at the skyline. He was looking inward, measuring something far less visible but far more important. Not profits, not deals, but legacy, the kind that is not written in contracts, but in moments. His assistant approached again, quietly, offering a brief update in a low voice. The video had spread further. Millions of views now. Headlines forming. Opinions dividing. But one thing remained consistent. Respect had become the center of the conversation. William listened, then gave a small nod, dismissing the need for further detail. Because the outcome that mattered had already happened in this room. The rest was just the world catching up. Naomi stepped away from the table, placing the final glass onto her tray, her shift nearing its end. She paused for a brief second near the edge of the room, not to reflect, but to reset. Because life would continue. Another shift. Another day. Another room. And not all of them would be like this one. But that did not change who she was when she walked into them. As she moved toward the service exit, William turned and caught her in his line of sight once more. "Miss Brooks," he called gently, not to stop her, but to meet her at the moment she was leaving. She turned, her posture the same, her presence steady. He stepped closer, not as a man of authority, but as someone choosing his words carefully. "What you carried tonight," he said, "most people would not have handled the same way." It was not admiration. It was recognition. Naomi held his gaze, her expression calm, grounded. "Most people are not used to being tested like that," she replied. Her voice was soft, but certain. William gave a slight nod, understanding more in that sentence than it seemed to hold. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "If you ever decide you want a different path, one where that strength is seen before it is tested, I would like to offer you that opportunity." It was not a transaction. It was an invitation. Naomi considered him for a moment, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just thoughtful. Then she gave a small, respectful nod. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I am already building something of my own." There was no defiance in her tone, only direction. William's expression shifted, just slightly, into something close to respect. Not the kind that comes from status. The kind that comes from clarity. "Then I have no doubt you will succeed," he said. And for the first time that night, there was nothing left to resolve. Naomi turned and walked toward the exit, her steps quiet, her presence leaving the room the same way it had moved through it. Without demand, without noise, but impossible to ignore. And as the door closed softly behind her, the room remained. The conversations continued. The city moved on. But something had changed. Not just for Ethan. Not just for William. For everyone who had witnessed it. Because power can fill a room. But dignity, it can redefine it.